At Easter brunch, my cousin smirked and said, "We all know you're just here for the free food. When's the last time you actually contributed?" I'd been anonymously paying their rent for 6 months after their eviction. So I just smiled, stood up, and said, "You're right. I should stop freeloading." Then I forwarded the rent receipts to everyone at the table and watched her face turn red. I, 32M, never thought Easter brunch would be the day I'd finally stop being the family's punching bag. But sometimes life gives you the perfect moment to stand up for yourself, and you just have to take it. Let me back up a bit. I've always been the quiet one in the family. The one who shows up to gatherings, brings a decent bottle of wine or a side dish, and sits in the corner while everyone else dominates the conversation. My cousin, let's just say she's the golden child. Always has been. She's loud, charismatic, and has this way of making herself the center of attention no matter where she is. For years, I watched her work the room at family events while I faded into the background. I didn't mind, really. I'm not built for that kind of spotlight. But there's a difference between being quiet and being a doormat, and somewhere along the way, I'd crossed that line without realizing it. It started about 8 months ago when I got a panicked call from my aunt. She was in tears, explaining that my cousin and her husband were being evicted from their apartment. They'd fallen behind on rent after he lost his job, and despite her working full-time at a salon, they couldn't catch up. The landlord had given them 30 days, and they had nowhere to go. My aunt was beside herself, asking if I knew anyone who could help, if I had any connections, anything at all. I told her I'd see what I could do. The truth was, I'd done well for myself over the past few years. I worked in tech, had gotten in early at a startup that eventually got acquired, and I'd walked away with enough money to live comfortably without being flashy about it. Nobody in my family knew the details. They knew I had a decent job, but I kept my finances private. I drove a modest car, lived in a nice but not extravagant apartment, and never flaunted anything. So when my aunt called, I made a decision. I contacted their landlord directly, paid off their back rent, and set up an arrangement to cover their monthly payments for 6 months. The landlord agreed to let them stay, and I made one condition. It had to be completely anonymous. The landlord would tell them that a benefactor had stepped in, but no names, no details. I didn't want credit. I didn't want the attention or the awkward thank yous or the inevitable family drama about who was helping who and why. I just wanted to help. My aunt called me back a week later, overjoyed. She told me that some miracle had happened, that an anonymous donor had saved them, and that they were staying in their apartment. I acted surprised, asked a few questions, and told her how wonderful that was. She never suspected it was me. Life went on. I continued showing up to family gatherings, continued being the quiet guy in the corner. My cousin never mentioned the eviction scare directly to me, but I'd hear bits and pieces through the family grapevine. She and her husband were doing better. He'd found a new job. They were getting back on their feet. I was genuinely happy for them. But here's the thing about being the quiet one. People forget you're listening. They forget you're even there sometimes. And my cousin had a habit of making little comments. Jokes, really. At least that's how she framed them. Jokes about how I always showed up to family dinners empty-handed, even though I never did. Jokes about how I must be struggling financially since I drove an older car. Jokes about how I probably couldn't afford to host Thanksgiving. So wasn't it great that she always stepped up? I let it slide. Every single time. Because that's what I did. I swallowed my pride, laughed along, and told myself it didn't matter. She didn't know what she was talking about. She didn't know that I was the one keeping her roof over her head. But this Easter brunch was different. The whole family was there. My parents, my aunt and uncle, my cousin and her husband, a few other relatives. We'd gathered at my aunt's house, and the dining room table was packed with food. Ham, scalloped potatoes, asparagus, rolls, 3 different desserts. It was the kind of spread that took hours to prepare, and everyone had contributed something. I'd brought a glazed carrot dish and a bottle of expensive wine that I knew my uncle would appreciate. We were about halfway through the meal when my cousin started in on me. She'd been talking about some renovation project she and her husband were planning for their apartment. New countertops, she said. Maybe a fresh coat of paint. She was animated, gesturing with her fork, and everyone was listening. Then she turned to me with that smile. The one that looks friendly but has an edge to it. She asked when I was planning to buy a place of my own instead of renting forever. I told her I was comfortable where I was, that I wasn't in a rush. She laughed and said something about how I must be saving every penny, that she understood times were tough for everyone. Then came the line that changed everything. She smirked, looked around the table to make sure she had an audience, and said that we all knew I was just there for the free food. She asked when the last time was that I'd actually contributed anything meaningful to the family. The table went quiet. A few people looked uncomfortable. My mom started to say something, but I could see my cousin wasn't done. She was on a roll. She added that it was fine, really, that everyone needed help sometimes, but maybe I should think about giving back a little instead of always taking. I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like clarity. Crystal clear, cold clarity. I'd spent months paying their rent, staying anonymous, asking for nothing in return, and here she was, in front of my entire family, calling me a freeloader. I set my fork down carefully. I looked at her, and I smiled. I told her she was absolutely right. I said I should definitely stop freeloading. Then I pulled out my phone. I'd kept every receipt, every bank statement, every communication with the landlord. Not because I planned to use them, but because I'm thorough about my finances. It took me about 30 seconds to pull up the email thread and forward it to the family group chat that we used for organizing gatherings. I hit send. I watched the phones around the table start buzzing. One by one, people picked them up. My uncle frowned at his screen. My mom's eyes went wide. My aunt put her hand over her mouth. My cousin's phone was sitting next to her plate. She glanced at it, saw the notification, and picked it up. I watched her face as she opened the email. The color drained from it first, then rushed back in a deep, blotchy red that spread from her neck to her forehead. She looked at me. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. My uncle was the first to speak. He asked what this was, his voice careful and confused. I explained simply and calmly. I told them that 6 months ago, when my cousin was facing eviction, I'd stepped in. I'd paid off her back rent and covered her monthly payments since then through an anonymous arrangement with her landlord. I'd asked to remain anonymous because I didn't want to make things awkward, but given the current conversation, it seemed relevant. The silence that followed was deafening. My cousin's husband was staring at his plate. My aunt was looking between me and her daughter with an expression I couldn't quite read. My cousin herself looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. She started to stammer something about not knowing, about how she never would have said anything if she'd known. I cut her off gently. I told her that was exactly the point. She didn't know. She'd made assumptions about my life, about my contributions, about who I was, without actually knowing anything. And instead of keeping those assumptions to herself, she decided to humiliate me in front of our family. I stood up. I thanked my aunt for hosting, told my parents I'd call them later, and said I needed to leave. I walked out of that dining room with my head high, and I didn't look back. My phone started blowing up before I even got to my car. My mom was calling. My aunt was texting. I ignored all of it and drove home. Update 1. The aftermath of that Easter brunch was something I didn't fully anticipate. I thought maybe there'd be some awkward conversations, a few apologies, and then we'd all move on. I was wrong. The first call I answered was from my mom, later that evening. She was upset, but not at me. She wanted to know why I hadn't told anyone what I was doing for my cousin. I explained my reasoning, that I didn't want credit, didn't want it to become a thing, didn't want family politics to get involved. She understood, but she was also hurt that I hadn't confided in her. I apologized for that. I told her I'd been trying to do the right thing in the way that felt right to me, but I could see how it might have looked like I didn't trust her. Then my aunt called. That conversation was harder. She was crying, apologizing for her daughter's behavior, thanking me over and over. I told her she didn't need to thank me. I'd helped because they needed it, not because I wanted gratitude. But she kept apologizing anyway, saying she'd raised her daughter better than that she didn't know where this entitled attitude had come from. I didn't have an answer for her. My cousin didn't call. Instead, she sent a long text message around midnight. It was rambling and defensive, full of excuses about stress and not knowing and how she'd just been joking. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she loved me like a brother, that she hoped I could forgive her. There was no real apology in it, just justifications. I didn't respond. Over the next few days, I learned through the family grapevine that my cousin was mortified. Apparently, several relatives had reached out to her directly, some supportive, others less so. My uncle had apparently had a long talk with her about gratitude and humility. Her husband had been silent through most of it, which I found interesting. The rent situation became complicated. I'd prepaid through the end of the month, but my 6-month commitment was technically up in 2 weeks. I'd been planning to extend it quietly for another few months, just to make sure they were really stable. But after Easter, I wasn't sure what to do. I decided to reach out to the landlord. I explained that the situation had become known to the family and that I wanted to end the anonymous arrangement. I asked if my cousin and her husband were current on any utilities or other expenses, and whether they'd been good tenants otherwise. The landlord confirmed they had been, and that with her husband's new job, they should be able to handle the rent going forward. I made one final payment to cover them through the next month, giving them time to adjust their budget, and then I closed the arrangement. I sent my cousin a brief email. I told her that the rent assistance would end after one more month, that I believed she and her husband were capable of handling it from there, and that I wished them well. I kept it professional and distant. I didn't want a response, and I made that clear. She responded anyway. This time, the message was different. Shorter. She said she was sorry, truly sorry, and that she understood if I didn't want to talk to her. She said she'd been taking me for granted for years, and that what she'd said at Easter was unforgivable. She didn't make excuses this time. She just apologized. I appreciated that, but I still wasn't ready to engage. I read it, and I left it at that. Family gatherings became awkward. My mom's birthday was a few weeks after Easter, and I showed up for that. My cousin was there too. She avoided me for most of the evening, staying on the opposite side of the room. When we finally crossed paths in the kitchen, she started to say something, but I just gave her a polite nod and moved on. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just didn't have anything to say. But something else started happening that I didn't expect. Other family members started opening up to me. My uncle pulled me aside at my mom's party and told me he respected what I'd done. He said it took character to help someone anonymously, and even more character to stand up for myself the way I had. My dad, who's usually pretty reserved, sent me a text saying he was proud of me. Even relatives I wasn't that close to started treating me differently. Less like the quiet guy in the corner and more like someone worth talking to. It was strange. I'd spent years being invisible, and suddenly people were seeing me. Update 2. It's been about 3 months since Easter, and things have settled into a new normal. My cousin and I still don't really talk, but the hostility is gone. It's more like we're distant relatives who happen to show up to the same events. Polite, but not warm. Her husband reached out to me about a month ago. He called, which surprised me. He said he wanted to thank me in person for what I'd done. He admitted that he hadn't known about the anonymous rent payments until Easter, and that when he found out, he was stunned. He said he'd felt like a failure for not being able to provide for his family during that rough patch, and knowing that someone had stepped in without expecting anything in return had meant more to him than I could know. He also apologized for his wife's behavior. He said she'd been under a lot of stress, which I already knew, and that she had a tendency to lash out when she felt insecure. He didn't excuse it, but he wanted me to understand where it came from. I appreciated the call. I told him I didn't hold anything against him, and that I hoped things continued to improve for them. They did, apparently. I heard through my mom that they'd started saving money, that they were doing well, and that my cousin had been making an effort to be more thoughtful in general. I was glad to hear it, even if we weren't close anymore. The bigger change, though, was in how I saw myself. For years, I'd let people underestimate me. I'd let them make assumptions, crack jokes, treat me like I was less than. And I told myself it didn't matter because I knew the truth about who I was and what I was capable of. But it did matter. It mattered because I'd been letting people disrespect me, and in doing so, I'd been disrespecting myself. Standing up at that Easter brunch wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about finally saying enough. It was about refusing to be invisible anymore. And it worked. Not because I humiliated my cousin, though that's certainly what happened, but because I set a boundary. I showed my family, and more importantly myself, that I wasn't going to be a doormat anymore. I've started being more present at family gatherings. Not louder or more attention-seeking, but more engaged. I contribute to conversations. I share stories. I let people see me, and it feels good. My cousin and I will probably never be close. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some relationships aren't meant to recover from certain moments. But I don't carry any anger toward her anymore. What happened at Easter was a turning point for both of us, I think. She learned that her words have consequences. I learned that silence isn't always strength. A few weeks ago, we had a family barbecue at my parents' house. My cousin was there with her husband. At one point, we ended up near each other by the grill. She looked at me, hesitated, and then said she was glad I came. I told her I was too. It wasn't much, but it was something. I don't know if we'll ever fully repair things, but I'm okay with that. I've spent enough of my life worrying about what other people think, trying to keep the peace, swallowing my pride. I'm done with that. From now on, I'm showing up as myself, fully and unapologetically. And if people don't like it, that's their problem, not mine. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too.